Trudeau's Liberal government doubles down on their censorship agenda. I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. The Toronto Sun reports that Elon Musk blasted Justin Trudeau's government on Sunday, last week, for its shameful decision to regulate streaming services that offer podcasts in Canada. Now, keep in mind, this comes after the disastrously idiotic move to regulate how social media companies interact with news publishers in Canada. I would have thought by now that Trudeau would have learned his lesson, but that's not true. So if you aren't aware, the Trudeau government tried to force social media companies to pay Canadian news outlets for the right to have their articles shared on these platforms. Now, instead of leaving these companies to deal with that issue themselves, Trudeau tried to get involved, and what happened was a mess. The social media companies didn't comply. They said, we're not paying for that. The media companies get tremendous exposure and benefit from interacting with us. Now, by de facto making it illegal to have these news outlets share articles on the various social media platforms, including Instagram and Facebook, the social media companies said, well, if that's the case, we're just not going to show any news. Now, if you're a Canadian, go try and check any local news outlets on social media, especially the meta platforms. You will not be able to see anything. Now, isn't that quite the situation? The Canadian government, led by Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party, has left us in a situation that mirrors many authoritarian regimes where we cannot access news freely on social media. Who would have thought this would have been a good idea? These outcomes were entirely predictable, and still the government moved forward with it. So it makes me wonder, why? There have been accusations that the government has did this on purpose, that they want you to not be able to access news, and perhaps that might be somewhat true, but I don't think that's the main reason here. It seems the government's too blinded by their own ignorance to know when they should stop. This situation was useful for nobody. The media companies now no longer have the exposure of social media in the Canadian market. That's going to be terrible for them and their ad-based model. Look at the Canadian citizens. We don't have news. Is that a good thing? Clearly not. Yet, in the wake of such a disaster, the Trudeau government decides to double down. The Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunications Commission plans to quote-unquote modernize Canada's broadcasting framework and ensure online streaming services make meaningful contributions to Canadian and Indigenous content. AKA, they're going to force different creative outlets to do what they want. Among the changes required include certain streaming services providing information about their activities and setting conditions for streaming services to be able to operate in Canada, which will include providing details about their content and subscribership to the government. Online streaming and podcasting services operating in Canada with $10 million or more in annual revenue in this country will have to register with the government as well. Now, the University of Ontario has a law professor, Michael Geist, who provided some commentary. He is the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law over there at U of Ottawa, and he describes the information being collected by the government as limited, but he suspects that there is going to be more to come from the CRTC. They're going to start with a baseline, and they're going to keep asking for more and more and more, and that's possible because the guidelines they're giving are so vague. When they say they're doing this because they want more Canadian and Indigenous content, what does that mean? Does that mean a Canadian produces the content? Does it mean you're talking about Canadian stuff? Like what, poutine and beavers? Or did they get to redefine what it means to be Canadian and they can use that as a barrier to keep certain content they don't like out from the market? Here's an example of how a slippery slope can emerge. Let's say you have critics who have things to say about Trudeau's current immigration policy, which they are free to do. There are pros and cons to it. But let's say the regulating body here, the CRTC, says that it's un-Canadian to do things like say anything negative about immigration because Canada needs that to thrive, and we are proud of our diversity, and it's our strength. This un-Canadian, xenophobic content cannot be allowed to stand under these new rules. Well, there's nothing inherently un-Canadian about raising concerns about immigration that is at a record level. It's true we need it, but where is the number? What's the right balance? Everything has a balance to it. You cannot overdo it on one end or the other. Too much or too little would be a disaster. But the government has this backdoor now to push upon you their agenda, to shield them from criticism, and to control the narrative. I'm not saying that's what they will do, but it's possible. So why give the government that power to begin with? Shouldn't we be free to talk about what we want when it comes to expressive mechanisms like podcasting? Who is the government to say that we need content to be more Canadian? We are Canadians. We'll define that for ourselves, not Trudeau and his ministers. Now, the law professor then goes on to say that he thinks a lot of people are going to look at these new regulations and think it's the thin edge of the wedge, and that more regulations are going to be on the way after this first batch gets approved, and I do agree with that. He then says the idea that you potentially would have to register with the Canadian government or with its agency, the CRTC, in order to engage in expression because you meet a certain threshold of revenue is, I think, a real incursion into expression. And I agree with that. There's too much government involvement there. Any podcasting or streaming group that earns revenue is already going to be registering with the CRA when they file their taxes. This isn't about revenue. It's not about money. It's about controlling expression to suit a government agenda. Whether you believe what they say is true, because they already admit that, they say their goal is for more Canadian and Indigenous content. That's their agenda. That's what they want to push. They want to actively exert pressure on the market to make their vision come alive. Another possibility is they have a secret agenda. They want more power, not just to push Canadian content to the average person, which might mean more local productions, but because they want to redefine what these words mean, they want more oversight, and they want to be heavy-handed. I'm a firm believer in the power of the market, and that leads me to conclude that the government is delusional. Even if you accept their face value agenda, they want more Canadian and Indigenous content. Well, if there was a desire for such things in the market, if Canadian consumers really cared, or they felt like there was a lack of Canadian content, and it truly mattered to them, people would already be there to fill the void in the market, and they would profit off that, or they would gain large followings off of that, or they would reap some benefit. But obviously, that's not the case. Is the government getting too involved to give people things that they don't want? Who really is complaining that there isn't quote-unquote Canadian content available to them? I'm not sure it's a legitimate concern. Certainly not one that warrants heavy-handed government intervention, especially when we've seen what happens when they try to do that with companies like Meta. It feels like we're moving further and further away from an ideal free market condition where companies are free to flourish and respond to citizens and market demands to one where the government thinks they know better and they're going to impose their wisdom on the population. Keep in mind too, we're talking about entertainment here. This is solely interpretable by the people and it's for the people. The government, in the best case here, is wasting resources on a silly adventure, and in the worst case will usher in an approval structure for expression that the ruling party can manipulate to suit their desires. And many companies are not going to have any part of that. They're going to do what Meta did and what Google is contemplating, simply avoiding the Canadian market in general. Now, we circle back to the initial question that we posed midway through. Why give the government a machete when all they need is a spoon? And then you're going to hope that they don't use the machete inappropriately. I'd rather not give them anything. Let me clarify further what this means. If you want more Canadian content, as the government is saying they do, there are other ways to achieve that if you truly believe it's a legitimate problem. Why doesn't the government offer grants and funding and sponsorship to produce that Canadian content, and then let that content perform based on its own merit? Let it go into the market. If people really resonate with that and they want it, it'll do well. And you'll have achieved your goal through less heavy-handed means. But no, the government doesn't want that spoon approach. They want you to give them a machete. They want to take over the scene, impose their will, have complete oversight over the industry, and they want you to trust them with that power. I'm sorry, but I can't do such a thing. It's nonsensical to have an already bloated bureaucracy gain more power, to have these companies need to register with you and for you to content police what's allowed and what's not. With very real crises on our hands in Canada, like a deteriorating healthcare system, like a explosively expensive real estate market, the government's choosing to focus on idiotic things like this. That really is a sign of the times. Now with that, it does bring us to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the material, be sure to leave a review and share to help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.